Hello everyone, welcome to another tutorial. I'm very excited today to talk to you about my personal favorite tool to use, and that is the American Scythe. We're going to go over selecting a vintage tool and how to get it set up and ready to work and do everything you need on the homestead or in maybe your suburban lawn as well. So in the world of scythes, at least here in the US, what you normally typically see sold by most companies selling new scythes is something similar, not exactly, but similar to this. It's what would be these days often called an Austrian scythe. It's kind of a misnomer, really. It's any continental European scythe is going to be fairly similar. There's different obvious regional differences, but fairly similar to this. And what they have in common in general, speaking broadly, is a monosteel, soft monosteel blade that is peened to thin it out and then honed. And it's often very light, and a lot of people like this. What you see here in the US, at least vintagely, there's only one place I know of to get them new, is an American style scythe. If we look at the differences, obviously we have a hardened steel blade that should never be peened, but is ground and then honed. And it has a curved steam bent handle, whereas the Austrian or continental European scythe is often straight or somewhat curved, but generally not as curved as this. These typically also have adjustable nibs, which are these handles here. And the affixing hardware is a little bit different, but that's not a major consideration. But these are the two things you generally have at your disposal. And in the US vintage, you generally, talking about flea markets, this is what you're going to find. I personally, having used both and given them a fair shakedown, I prefer the American scythe. I just feel like it really got a lot of bad reputation, specifically because of a lot of people selling these. And just a lot of knowledge was lost by the few people who still knew how to use these well. They never really wrote anything down, or not much. So there's just not a lot of knowledge. Also, when you're out looking for these, you notice this thing is very large, very thick. The handle is almost like a baseball bat. The biggest problem with these is by the end of the era of these being used, they were really only being made and used by railroad workers to clear right-of-ways. People weren't cutting hay with these anymore, and so the companies were wanting these big, heavy, rough tools to clear rough growth, saplings and brush that these days you might use a chainsaw for. So when you find these, they're often really heavy, but I'll show you how you can fix that because it's not ideal for grass work. Here I've got a selection of different blades just to give you an idea of what you might want to search for, or in some cases avoid. Here at the top we've got that Austrian, it says here made in Austria type blade here. This is actually a 40-inch long grass blade, which is very light and slim. It's actually about the same weight as this Austrian blade. This is a Western grass blade. It's a little shorter, about 30 inches, and it has this deeper heel here, which really helps cutting longer, tougher vegetation. I really like this one for mowing tall hay and stuff like that. This is a weed blade, about 20-inch weed blade, so it's got a wider blade, better for your rougher things, your weed whacker type jobs around buildings and stuff in tighter places, cutting sometimes larger goldenrods and other type weeds. This is something here. This is a big heavy ditch or bramble blade. It's only about 16 inches long. Very heavy, unbent tang. It's for really rough stuff. You're getting deep into road ditches or cutting just thick, overgrown fields with saplings the size of your thumb and stuff like that. That's where this comes into play with a big heavyweight snath, something like this. If you're trying to mow your lawn, you want something, something that appears like this. It doesn't have to be 40 inches long, 24, 30 inches, 36 inches is a really good grass blade. If you're getting into cutting your own hay for animal fodder or just to clean up longer grasses, these Western blades are really nice for that. with a more curved and this deeper heel on the blade. So these are selection of blades that you can find, and there's many more. This is just the basic types of American blades and a comparison with an Austrian blade. So after we look at the blades, we're going to look at the snath, or the handle of the scythe. If you're out and about, depending on what you need it for, will depend on what you will determine what you're going to find and what you're going to look for. So if you need something for really rough field reclamation and brush, you might be fine with something like this. If you want to mow your lawn, if you want to cut hay all day long and not get tired, you can still work with something like this, because more than likely this is what you're going to find. I would say 90% of the time these are what you're going to find, because it's just what was produced in mass by the end of the era of the American Scythe were these. I've been lucky enough a couple of times to find an actual grass snath, which is a very thin, and this actually wasn't one, believe it or not. This started off like this big heavy baseball bat thing, and I just put it in a vise and I shaved it down. You can just shave them down until they're thin and are light enough to work well for grass. So if you want to mow your lawn, if you want to have good hay cutting experiences, get something like this, turn into this. Also, while you're out there, look at the hardware, make sure it has all the pieces and they're not completely, they're going to be rusted. They're going to be rusted, but make sure they're not rusted through or destroyed or broken. And look at the nibs, which are these little handles here. Make sure they're not, cracked apart or destroyed. They're probably going to be frozen, but that's okay. You'll soak them in some penetrating oil and they'll probably come back open. And we'll show you how to adjust those. So get you a snath and slim it down or enjoy it as it is. Sometimes with vintage techniques and tools, information and knowledge just gets lost. I had a horribly difficult time in the beginning trying to figure out this most basic and humble farming tool, how to properly sharpen and set this thing up to work effectively. And I think a lot of people have had that problem and ended up just giving up and getting rid of the scythe or buying an Austrian type scythe because they couldn't figure out how the American scythe was intended to be used and set up. And it's really sad. I guess a lot of things that were common knowledge and everybody just knew how to do it, nobody took the time or thought it was important to write it down in the past. So I had a hard time, and I'm going to try to help you not have as much of a hard time. Luckily, I was just too stubborn to quit. So what I finally learned, thankfully, especially to the help of Benjamin Bouchard and his Channel 42 blades, thinness of the blade is really where the money is at. So we can sharpen a scythe as keenly as you like, to whatever grit, whatever compound. It can be mirror finished and incredibly sharp, and it just won't cut grass. It'll push over the grass and it won't cut it, and it's very frustrating, and you'll throw it down and want to quit. What you need is a very thin and sharp blade. It must be ground like a straight razor, because really cutting hair and cutting fine grass has some similarities. There's not as much resistance to the blade. So where an axe has all the resistance of a tree, the grass will want to push. So you really need a very thin blade. And in the past, that's why everybody had a big grindstone and knew how to use it. So get the blade ground down. A hollow grind I find is best, so that it's really thin. I mean, it should be paper thin right behind the edge. And that's the grinding part. Remember, this is an American scythe, so we don't peen it with a hammer to thin it out like an Austrian scythe. So that's one part of the battle. The other part is the tang angle, or the tangle, if you like that better. From the factory, the tang will be straight, vertical, and in line with the blade. The reason being, they didn't know what you were going to use it for at the factory. If you're using it for hay, this is my often used hay and long weed blade, it's straight. And that means that the blade won't lay very low to the ground. It won't cut the grass very low. When it's on the side, it might ride something like this, which is fine if you're cutting hay. If you're cutting a lawn and you want carpet length grass, it's not going to work. It needs to be lower. Well, back in the day, people knew this. They understood that. You took the blade and your scythe to your local blacksmith, and you said, "Hey, John, I want to use this to cut my lawn, and I want it to be that high." And he said, "Well, You're about 5'11", and he took the blade and he heated it up in the forge or with a torch, and he bent the tang to match your height and the length of grass that you wanted to cut. So these are three different really bad drawings of tang angles. You can see here's a representation of a straight from the factory tang, one that's been bent over a few degrees, and one that's been bent even more. If you can see this one, I've bent this one quite a bit. See, it's laying over to give a lower cut. And we're going to show you how to do that here in a second. When you're honing, you'll want something like this honing stone. Grit isn't that important. It's not as important as the hollow grind. But the hollow grind, as I'm trying to draw here, also permits you to have a no-brainer when you're honing. You just lay the stone. It should contact the spine of the blade and the edge at the same time. If it's not, you want to grind it some more. And I'll show you when I hone how that goes. But these stones, they're often called a canoe stone, a scythe stone. Baryonyx Knife Company sells the best I've ever tried. Their Arctic Fox is what I use every day. It's amazing. It's a well-designed tool. So the first thing we got to do is get this blade ground. Get that hollow grind on here, right? So there's three ways that I know of, there's probably more, that you can do this. Most of the time I've used these single hand crank grinders. They're a little bit tricky, especially with a longer blade. You kind of have to go at an angle and be constantly moving the blade like this to get in there and grind it down. That's one way to do it. Another way, you can get you these little Dremel burr things. Put it in a drill or a Dremel tool, and carefully you can grind down like that. A third option is a file. If you've got a really good file, you got to be careful. Some of these are just too hard to file, but sometimes you can get in there and thin that down with a file. Be my least favorite option, but it's a possibility if that's all you have. But in any case, whatever you use, go slow if it's a grinder, because this is very thin metal, so you can heat this up and lose the temper quickly. So if you are using a grinder or an electric tool, go slow and move constantly on the stone to keep it cool. Okay, so to bend the tang to get the desired level of cut we need to put the scythe in a vise just behind the tang here, and we need something like either a bending fork like this or maybe a piece of pipe. In the beginning I didn't have this, so I just used a piece of square pipe that would fit on the tang there as a wrench mechanism, and a torch like this little propane torch, and the most important tool, a potato. So we stick the potato on the blade. You just shove it right on there, nice and deep. Get that potato on there, and this is going to keep the blade from overheating and losing your temper while you heat it up with a torch. Now that it's good and hot, we can bend the blade gently without it cracking. It only takes a few degrees. It doesn't look like anything to you guys, but in the shade it's actually a dull red color. And that's all there is to bending the blade. And you have a nice, well-cooked potato at the end too. So with the scythe vertically standing up next to our body, we stand up nice and straight. We should be able to put the top handle right about in our armpit. And then the second handle should be 1 cubit lower from the top handle. And that gives us to place our handles. If you need to adjust these, it's very important to know they're left-handed threaded. So if you try to unloosen them like a normal bolt, you'll just end up breaking everything or not being able to. So they actually go to the right clockwise to loosen and counterclockwise to tighten. So if you need to adjust them, go clockwise. And you may have to soak these in some penetrating oil for a while, loosen them up. You want to adjust these so that when you have your correct stance, we want to bend our knees, keep our back straight, but bend our knees, lean slightly forward. We want to hold the hold the nib like a guide, but actually rest the palm of our hand, brace it on the actual main part of the snap itself on both handles. We shouldn't have to do this. This is not correct actually. It should be like this. So the nibs are more like guides. If you've got Nosferatu fingers, it might just take 2 fingers to guide. So we don't want to ever do this like you may have tried or seen before. This is not how you use a scythe. It's a shearing action. You're making a circular pass around your body like this. If you can, bend your knees, keep your back straight, lean forward, and do this, you can scythe all day. It's very simple. So when we talked about and showed adjusting this tang here by heating it up and bending it, what that is affecting is this angle. If I move this up and down, you can see if the tang was straight, it might be like this, and then it wouldn't cut the grass very low. But if we bend it, we can consecutively bend it until it gets lower and lower. So we can cut our grass shorter or higher depending on how we want, depending on our personal height of our body and the snap and the tang. And that's where I was talking about, back in the day, you take it to blacksmith and he would adjust it by bending it until it was the right lay for the individual person and their desired cut. One really great thing about the American pattern of scythe is how adjustable some of these, like this is an old derby and ball snap, and it has these 2 bolts on the back, and you loosen these up, and notice you've got 2 different tang placements for your blade, 2 different holes, and each hole can pivot over this long distance here, back and forth, and gives you really a massive range of adjustment for different lays of ground, heights of material you're cutting, just all kinds of things. And you can out in the field just take a wrench and adjust it on the fly if you're going on a steep hillside or you've got different kinds of grass or whatever you can do. A lot of adjustment options there for you. So for honing the blade, a lot of people like to use 2 different stones. These are both of these stones I have here are made by Baryonyx Toolworks. This is their Arctic Fox, and this is a little bit coarser stone. If you do use 2 stones, you'd start with the coarser one. We're just placing the stone on the spine like this, and we're coming down, and we should touch the spine and the edge. But we always want to start on the back side away from us first, and then the front. Back and front. Back and front. We do that because if we do develop a burr, we actually want it pointed up into the grass, not down into the soil. So we always start back here at the heel. Just progress our way down the blade. And if we want to use a finer stone, we come back with our finer stone. These are water stones, so you soak them in a pouch on your belt. One reason I do prefer the American style scythe over the continental European scythe is I find that I have to maintain it much less. I find I hone less than half as often. The other day we did a video on cutting our orchard more than an acre. I counted 8 honings in that entire acre. With a continental European, with a peened blade, you often have to hone every 5 minutes or more often. With these, sometimes it's every 20 minutes. It's just much harder steel. Also, if you were to scythe for a day or often half a day, you would have to stop and peen out your blade again. Whereas these, I can get away with grinding this blade to thin it a few times a year. Maybe once or twice a year I have to grind the blade, and the rest of the time I just hone it. So to me that makes more sense. The other thing I didn't mention was I find that these type of scythes can more easily cut through rougher vegetation, also a wider range of vegetation. So for a quick demonstration of the technique I like to use with the scythe, comfortable distance apart for the feet, bend the knees, keep the back straight, lean slightly forward. You go in a circular pattern. Keep the blade on the ground and just slide it back and forth. It's engaging the ground the whole way around. There's no difficulty in this. I'm relaxed, I'm barely touching the handle. I'm just sliding the blade across the grass. And because it's ground thin and honed, it cuts everything like a laser beam. It's a very relaxing way to cut the grass. No noise, fumes, or anything. Very easy. I hope this tutorial has been helpful. I hope anybody who wanted to use a scythe, maybe who's interested in American Scythes, can find some helpful tips in how to set one up from all of this. I'm not lying when it really is my favorite tool to use. I find a lot of enjoyment and satisfaction out of cutting the grass with one of these. It's not just a romantic ideal or a masochistic thing on my part. It's really very practical and very useful tool. I would highly recommend anybody who can't find one vintage or doesn't have the time or feel like they have the skills to set one up the way I showed, Baryonyx Knife Company, Benjamin Bouchard, he offers new American Scythes already set up and catered to your needs. He also offers those stones I showed sharpening with and a lot of other components like handles that you might need. I would also like anybody, if you have ideas for other tutorials, please put those in the comments to this video. Thank you very much.